In a quiet workshop by the bay, an old mechanic gets a call from the same Navy that once cast him out. He walks alone into the naval base. Young engineers scoff, unaware that the man with the toolbox once built the heart of their ship. With a brass rod and silence, he listens to the engine, hearing what machines say when computers fail to understand.
This turbine is
the same man they doubted is now teaching them.
With respect,
Respect isn't demanded. It's earned through silence, patience, and precision. From the sky, he watches the ship sail strong again, not for applause, but for truth finally restored. The engine of one of the Navy's most advanced destroyers failed just days before a critical overseas deployment. 5 top engineers from different branches tried every diagnostic method available: thermal scans, system recalibrations, component replacements. Nothing worked. The launch was at risk, the mission teetering on the edge of cancellation. In a last-ditch effort, someone on the team mentioned a name that hadn't been spoken in years. Not from any current roster, not from any database. Just a name passed around like an old rumor: Elijah Ward. Miles away, in a quiet coastal town called Pinehurst, Elijah was elbow-deep in an old fishing trawler's corroded motor. His workshop, converted from an abandoned boathouse, was filled with rusted parts, vintage gauges, and a coffee pot that hissed louder than it brewed. At 71, Elijah had no formal titles left. No clearance, no uniform, no rank. But anyone who had ever worked with him knew this man didn't just fix engines. He understood them, down to their heartbeat. Once, he'd been the Navy's top machinery engineer. His hands helped develop the first generation of propulsion systems now used in frontline destroyers. But years ago, a mechanical failure during a training exercise at sea led to a brutal investigation. Elijah was blamed for negligence and removed quietly from service. No hearing, no defense, just a folded letter and silence. Now, the Navy was desperate. And when Admiral Keegan made the call that afternoon, Elijah didn't say much, just wiped his hands on a greasy rag, listened and said, "Send a car." Because deep down he knew this wasn't just about fixing an engine. It was about something long overdue. Elijah arrived at the naval base just after sunrise, his weathered toolbox in one hand, his old Navy ID in the other. The guards at the checkpoint barely glanced at the badge before exchanging smug looks. To them, he was just another outdated mechanic, an old man clinging to memories of a service that no longer remembered him. "Where you headed, sir?" one of the young recruits asked. "Intermediate maintenance facility," Elijah replied calmly. The recruit paused, checked the system, and waved him through with a shrug. As Elijah stepped past the gate, the familiar scent of salt, oil, and steel filled his lungs. Ahead, docked like a sleeping beast, was the USS Brigham, a destroyer of the Arleigh class. Sleek, lethal, and motionless, because its heart refused to beat. Inside the facility, the air buzzed with quiet urgency. Engineers worked in tight formation around the LM-2500 gas turbine engine, which lay exposed on a reinforced base, stripped of its casing like a wounded animal under surgery. Tools clinked, scanners beeped, and every eye turned when Elijah entered the room. His presence caused a ripple, not one of admiration, but skepticism. "That's the guy?" someone whispered. "Wasn't he the one who got dismissed after the incident in '08? Didn't know dinosaurs still carried toolboxes." At the center of the operation stood Chief Engineer Malcolm Reyes, clipboard in hand, posture stiff. He didn't extend a handshake. "Mr. Ward," he said, tone clipped. "We've tried everything. Replaced valves, tested all circuits, even swapped the entire fuel regulation module. After 90 seconds, the engine drops power every time." Elijah nodded. "You run it hot yet?" Reyes scoffed. You want us to stress an already failing engine? If you don't, you'll never hear what it's really saying. More murmurs. But Elijah didn't flinch. He placed a brass rod, its edges smoothed by decades of use, against the engine's side and brought the other end to his ear. "Start it," he said. Reyes hesitated. "For how long?" 45 seconds idle, then full throttle for 30. "That's dangerous." "So is guessing." Reyes gave the nod. Engines roared. Everyone held their breath. At precisely 75 seconds, Elijah's hand shot up. "Shut it down!" He stepped back, eyes closed, running the sound through his mind like a composer reviewing a complex score. "It's not contamination," he said finally. "Your rotors are drifting. There's a harmonic imbalance, one that builds just before maximum RPM. You've got axial misalignment, probably a hairline shift in the mounting shaft." Silence. Reyes blinked. "That wasn't picked up by any of our scans." "Because you weren't listening," Elijah said, tapping the brass rod. And with that, he turned, toolbox in hand, leaving behind a stunned room and the first crack in their doubt. The sun had already begun to dip by the time Elijah returned to Pinehurst. The workshop was quiet, save for the faint hum of an old radio playing a country tune through crackling static. He wiped his hands, checked a half-assembled outboard motor, then climbed the steps to his small loft. Just as he sat down to rest, his phone buzzed on the workbench. Unknown caller. He let it ring once, twice, then answered. "Ward speaking." A voice on the other end, more reserved than before, replied, "Mr. Ward, it's Chief Engineer Reyes." Elijah leaned back. "Didn't expect to hear from you again." "We re-ran the tests. Your call on the misalignment. It was correct. We used the laser tracker like you said. Turns out the rotor shaft was off by less than 2 millimeters. Not enough to register structurally, but just enough to throw off the harmonic balance. The vibration increased exactly at the point you described. That was the cause." There was a pause. "You saved the ship," Reyes added, his voice quieter now. "The USS Brigham will launch on schedule." Elijah closed his eyes, exhaled slowly. Not in triumph, but in something closer to relief. Reyes continued. "The Admiral, he wants you back at the base tomorrow." He said, "No more back doors, no more favors owed. Just a proper thank you." Elijah didn't say anything right away. He turned to the window, watching the sky outside his loft turn the color of steel. "All right," he said simply. The next morning, the whir of helicopter blades filled the air above Pinehurst. It descended onto the weathered dock behind Elijah's workshop, sending dried leaves into a cyclone. A young Navy lieutenant stepped out and approached him. "Mr. Ward, I'm here on behalf of Admiral Keegan." Elijah grabbed his old toolbox. Same as always. No suitcase, no medals. Just the tools of a man who listened to engines better than he listened to most people. When they landed, things felt different. There was no smirking at the checkpoint, no sideways glances in the corridor. A small group of officers waited silently on the tarmac, standing at ease but watching with intent. At the front was Admiral Keegan, stern, silver-haired, but unmistakably respectful. "Elijah Ward," the Admiral said, extending his hand. "You were right. About everything. About the engine. About the way we handled your retirement." Elijah met his handshake with a firm nod. "You should have never been dismissed like that," the Admiral continued. "We reviewed the original drill logs. Turns out the system flagged the wrong fault line. The cause of failure wasn't your responsibility. It never was. We owe you an apology and recognition." He handed Elijah a white envelope. "Your compensation," he said, "and an official letter of exoneration, clearing your record." For a moment, Elijah just stood there, toolbox in one hand, envelope in the other. Not for the money, not even for the apology, but because for the first time in years, someone in uniform had looked him in the eye and spoken the truth. Then, Reyes stepped forward. "I owe you something too, Mr. Ward," he said, his tone softer now. "I studied those engines my whole career. Thought I knew them inside and out. But what you showed me, I didn't learn that in any manual. You taught me to listen." Elijah chuckled, a dry sound like rust on a crankshaft. "Machines talk," he said. "Most folks just forget how to hear." Reyes smiled. "Maybe next time, you'll teach us." Elijah gave a slight nod, then walked toward the helipad again, boots echoing against the damp concrete, carrying the same dented toolbox that had once gotten him thrown out, and now brought him back in. Back at the maintenance facility, word had already spread. The old mechanic who was once treated like an outdated relic had now become the reason the USS Brigham would sail on time. The technicians who had once whispered behind clipboards now stood a little taller when Elijah passed. A few even nodded silently, acknowledging what their metrics couldn't. The man didn't just fix an engine, he restored faith. Inside Bay 3, the LM-2500 turbine was already reassembled, gleaming beneath overhead lights. It hummed now, not in protest, but in harmony. Balanced. Ready. The destroyer's launch sequence had resumed, with no delays on the schedule. Naval Command released a private bulletin crediting an external consultant with decades of specialized experience for the solution. Everyone knew who that meant, but Elijah didn't ask for his name in reports. He never had. The Admiral offered him a permanent advisory position, a corner office, full security clearance reinstated, even a new uniform if he wanted it. He politely declined. "I don't need a desk," Elijah said, "and I've already had my time in uniform." What mattered more to him came that afternoon, when a group of young Navy mechanics gathered by his side, asking questions, not out of protocol, out of curiosity, out of respect. They wanted to understand how he knew, how he heard what machines were trying to say when nothing else worked. Elijah smiled, pulled the brass rod from his toolbox, and placed it in one recruit's hands. "You listen," he said. "You don't just test. You don't just measure. You feel. Every sound has a story." It wasn't a lecture. It was a moment, one passed between generations, between systems and soul. Outside, the USS Brigham's engines powered up for final checks. Elijah stepped out of the facility, the rhythmic thrum of turbines echoing behind him like a distant heartbeat. He paused, hand resting on the railing, watching the gray hull shimmer under the late afternoon light. It was no longer the ship that reminded him of disgrace. It was now the vessel that carried proof he'd never been wrong and never truly forgotten. As the helicopter rose from the base, Elijah sat by the window, toolbox resting on his lap like an old friend. Below, the USS Brigham pulled away from the dock, its engines running in perfect sync, cutting clean lines through the bay water. He watched in silence, not for glory, not for revenge, but for closure. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a ghost moving through metal halls. He felt seen, validated not by medals or files, but by truth, finally spoken aloud. From above, the destroyer looked small against the sea, but to Elijah, it was everything, a symbol of what he'd built, what he'd lost, and now, what he had reclaimed. The pilot glanced back. "All good, sir?" Elijah nodded. Yeah, real good. And as the coastline faded behind him, he whispered, not to anyone in particular, but maybe to the ship below, "You were never broken, just misunderstood."